Hello, welcome to Picture Me Coding. My name is Erik Aker. I have my co-host with me, Mike Mull. Hi, Mike.
Hey there.
Mike, how you doing this week?
I'm doing pretty well. I'm in the lovely Midwest and nice fall weather here.
I hear it's lovely there this time of year.
It's a little bit cold if you're from San Diego, but it looks nice.
I listened to our last episode, and I want you to know that we went 6 episodes without a Wittgenstein reference.
Oh my goodness.
It's, it's a good
I guess
number.
we
I
have
don't
to
know if
do a
this doesn't count. I hope.
do we have to do an all Wittgenstein episode now?
No, no, I don't. I don't want to do that. So you drove across the country, and now you're in the Midwest. What have you been listening to over there?
So Sufjan Stevens has a new album out. I am historically a pretty big fan of his. Um, the last few years he's been doing things that are a little out of the norm, kind of some instrumental orchestral type stuff and some collaborations, and it's been interesting. But this new album is kind of more what I expect from him. um, if you're a fan of Carrie and Lowell or Illinois or albums like that, this is much more in that vein. um, I'm a big fan of it. There's a couple of really good songs, I think, as good as songs as good as he has done. um, I think the overall album is maybe not quite as good as my favorites like Illinois or Carrie and Lowell, but I think it's still a pretty strong album, and it's kind of nice to hear him, you know, returning to form, I guess. Um, this album, it's a little sad. I've read some things about, I guess, his partner of many years passed away in April, and I guess
Wow, I
he's
didn't
also
hear that.
been Yeah, and I guess he's also been suffering from some sort of autoimmune uh, disease that's made it difficult for him to walk and things like that. So,
Wow,
uh,
that's a bummer.
yeah, so I think he's been dealing with some issues and some grief, and some of this music was made during the pandemic years, so I think that influences it too. So I think I read one article that described it as a grief soundtrack, which
Hmm.
you know seems to comport with my the way I'm hearing it, but. Anyway, I really like it. I think it's strong throughout, and it it ends with the Neil Young cover, which is also kind of interesting.
Hmm. I'm warming up to it, I think. I was a little unsure. Years ago, after Illinois and Michigan, I loved those albums so much. I read an interview with him where he kind of complained that his sound was becoming this adult contemporary sound, and I was always kind of insulted by that. I love those records that you're calling adult contemporary Sufjan Stevens.
Yeah, yeah. I have to admit, Illinois is probably one of my top 20 albums of all time. So
Me too. Me too.
if that's adult contemporary, I'll cop to liking that.
Yeah, I think I understood that he was, as an artist, wanting to move beyond this voice that he had, but he felt maybe stuck in the voice. But I just love that music so much, and his
Yeah,
expression of wanting to move beyond. I was kind of like, you're making fun of this thing, that this feeling that I have that I love it. I don't think he was, but it's funny you mentioned grief because last week our cat died, Bertrand Russell, and I had the strongest relationship with him of any animal I've ever really had in my life. He loved me so much, way, way more than I deserved. And I was pretty sad when he died. It really caught me by surprise. And I just immediately wanted to hear this Cat Power song, which I had heard in the 90s. It was on some mix CD. And the song is He Was a Friend of Mine. And I remember it as being just maybe a 3 chord song. And it's a grief song. And I know it sounds like a bad joke. My cat died, so I listened to Cat Power. But it wasn't at all, not at all what I had in mind. It's like, I was really experiencing grief, and I needed to listen to someone who had the greatest capacity to give voice to this grief so that I wouldn't be dragged down, to the bottom of the ocean with it like ballast. So listening to Cat Power, who can give voice to grief, is like just a healing feeling. Anyway, I couldn't find this recording. Um, I mean, I had it on a mixed CD in the '90s. I don't know where it even came from, uh, but I did find versions of her recording at like live performances where she would start this song. He was a friend of mine, and then she would launch into this song "Shivers," which I'd never heard. I guess it was originally sung by Nick Cave. Have you ever heard this song "Shivers"?
No, you sent it to me, and I don't think I have heard it either by her or by Nick Cave.
Well, I guess it's a pretty well-known song. It was written by a guy named Roland Henry, maybe? I can't remember his name, but he was in this band, The Boy Next Door, with Nick Cave in the late '70s, and he wrote this song. But this song is just really powerful. And I think there's a couple things about Cat Power. I honestly believe this is not facetious. It's not insincere at all. I think she's one of the greatest singers of our generation. And another aspect of her is she does a lot of cover songs, and her cover songs are artistic reimaginings of these things. Like she'll take a song and completely turn it inside out, and it'll become a thing you didn't know it could become. And that reminds me of listening to Coltrane do My Favorite Things or a Billie Holiday song. They're covering songs, but they become works of art that are completely unrecognizable in relation to the thing they're based on. There's so much art and beauty in there that I love it so much. She has a great voice for being able to express grief. So it was really healing for me to listen to her sing this song and feel bad about this cat that I missed.
Yeah, I really like her voice too. It's kind of distinct and rich.
I can't help but immediately want to hear anything that she releases. I just can't help it. It's like if I hear she's released a thing, I have to hear it.
Is there a story behind the cat's name? I've forgotten.
My wife asked me that. Why did you want to call him Bertrand Russell? And I just sort of I usually act on instinct. I open my mouth and stuff comes out. He looked very serious. He looked like the kind of cat who would work for years on something very mentally wrought and then maybe also have an affair with his co-author's wife.
That sounds like a very cat thing to do. Yes.
Yeah, he just reminded me, just had this very serious, sincere look on his face. And someone did a painting of him.
Oh, that's cool. It's a shame nobody can see it. I guess maybe
Yeah.
we should put it in the show notes or something.
Yeah, I'll post it somewhere. He was a beautiful cat, and he loved me a lot more than felt like I deserved. So, bye bye, Bertrand Russell.
My condolences.
Thank you.
For our software topic this week, I wanted to sort of go back in history a little bit to my early days. My first job, there was I was like 22, 23, I guess, and there was a programmer at the same organization who was pretty close to retirement, like mid 60s. Um, he was a great guy, very smart. He'd come out of uh, the nuclear labs and was a former nuclear engineer. But at this point in his career, just a year or two away from retirement, he had kind of become super specialized and was mostly an expert in this language called LRL-TRAN, which was a sort of extension of Fortran that had also come out of the nuclear labs. I think LRL stands for Lawrence Radiation Lab or something like that.
Wow, that sounds
Um,
highly specialized. I've never heard of
LRL
LRL Tran.
Tran. Yeah. Um, at a glance, it looked a little bit like Fortran, but they used it for a lot of things, including like system level programming, and um, it was used pretty widely in those labs, Livermore and Magnetic Fusion Energy Lab and places like that. Um, anyway, I really respected this guy, but I kind of decided at that point in my career that, I didn't want to be super specialized. I wanted to try to keep abreast of the latest things that were happening and try to keep up on the technology and so forth. And, now I'm sort of approaching his age. And, I think to a certain extent I've accomplished that goal. But there's kind of two things over the years that have come up that have made it challenging. One is just the nature of our industry that things change so rapidly that every 10 years or so you're faced with a new set of tools to learn or new languages that are popular and so forth. And I think the other thing that is hard is that, you invest a lot of energy into learning certain things. And then when new projects come up, you immediately jump to that new technology or to that comfortable technology, um, and you try to apply it. Sometimes it's appropriate and sometimes it's not. It just happens to be the comfortable thing. So the point of this being that I think one skill that you kind of have to possess um, or learn as an engineer is the ability to sort of change your mind about things.
Hmm.
Um, to a certain extent, this was inspired by a blog post that I saw on LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago by an engineer named Henrik Warren or Henrik Warney, who wrote, an article about things that he's changed his mind about during his career. And I thought that might be an interesting thing for us to discuss here as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting story. I gotta say, I'm not sure I would trust someone if they admitted to having never changed their mind. I sort of think that that's a trait that I would want to have. I'd be nervous about
Yeah,
someone who never
yeah.
changed their mind.
I've seen some quotes about that. I can't remember the speakers, but basically people saying that if you don't change your mind, it's probably a bad sign, at least
Yeah, I would think
occasionally.
so. Yeah. I guess I don't know if it's so much like things I sometimes I'll change my mind thinking, "Oh, I guess I made a mistake thinking we would use that." But I did have an idea. Well, one example is at my current role, I thought we would use these low code or no code tools for certain integrations. So for integrating data, from one system to another. So I can like send out an event and all I need is to take some attributes from that event and push them over to some other system. And I thought, wow, there are these low code tools. At the time, we used these Azure things called logic apps, but there were other things out there. There's a whole like platform called Bubble where you can make web applications. I mean, Salesforce is based on this. Salesforce has all these declarative tools, which are all like low code or no code. They even have the motto clicks over code. I thought, wow, this would be really cool for us because we can have developers who are working on these software applications. They can emit some events, and we can have people who are non developers look at these low code or no code tools in order to take some data from those events and get them over to systems that they're looking at that they care about. It seemed like a good idea. These are really easy to work on. But there were two problems that came up, which caused me to really revise my thinking about them. One was the people I imagined who would be the people who were making changes to these non devs or people who were more in admin roles or even like stakeholders who are looking at things and they care about data landing in their services that they're viewing, but they're not developers. Those people never ended up doing any of the work I thought they would do. It was just like, here's the door, here's the keys, just walk right in and click on some things and it'll change. The other problem, and I saw this a lot with Salesforce declarative tools, is that these declarative tools emulate programming environments, but if you have no experience building software applications, you often don't anticipate the types of things we run into and we kind of cultivate experience about. So, like looping inside loops and things not necessarily about even performance or efficiency in this case, but things that are very hard to reason about. So you could like declarative low code, code tools, they give you a lot of rope to hang yourself with. And if you already have a background in building software, you can kind of see maybe how to refactor the stuff. But then a lot of people who know how to write software, they're like, well, I'll just write code because I can read it from top to bottom. It's so much easier than dealing with this low code tool where I'm going to go and click stuff and drag boxes around. So I
Yeah, that's
changed my
my
mind.
impression.
Go
My
ahead.
impression too is that they never really do make it to the end user or the domain expert level. They, no matter how easy you make them, they tend to still be used mostly by developers, which is probably ruining the point to some extent.
And developers, I don't even think prefer them. They prefer code. It's easier actually to read it. You know?
There were some examples of that, I think, going back probably to the 90s or so that I found useful. There were like sort of like workflow tools that you could use to build visualizations and things like that. So I don't think they are a I don't think that the concept is a total failure. I just think that it hasn't two things. One is I think people think that it's going to replace devs, which doesn't seem to have happened. And the other one, as you say, is that they don't really make it to the domain experts like you expect them to.
Hmm. What other things have you changed your mind about? You have other examples?
I think the thing that's probably comes to mind for me first is so-called NoSQL databases.
Hmm.
And I think this goes back to the point about, you learn something deeply and then you want to, you want to use that as the hammer for every nail that you encounter. So for me at the time when NoSQL databases were, coming out in the world and being used in real applications, I had already developed a pretty deep level of skill with relational databases and SQL. And so I think that was one point of resistance for me was that, I heard about these things and I was like, no schemas, no integrity constraints, eventual consistency. That doesn't sound like a database to me.
Hmm.
Um,
And you were clinging to your existing assumptions about databases.
yeah. And I think also, you know, I'd worked on some projects where we had to keep things, say, in a cache because we needed our web service to be faster. And so we built caches around maybe like, Java's concurrent hash maps or something like that. And so when I started to see some of these NoSQL databases, that was just like, oh, that's just a cache. You can't call that a database. Um, I encountered Redis pretty early, and Redis seemed okay to me because it was literally a cache. But some of these other database systems just seemed like they were abusing the notion of databases.
Hmm.
Um,
So, but you changed your mind. What made you change your mind, and what's your opinion now?
yeah, so I've come around pretty pretty far on that opinion. I think one reason is because I started to see the use cases for them. I started to see why people were using that technology as opposed to relational databases. Um, th- they really do have a lot of utility in web applications where they are read heavy, and
Hmm.
you really need lots of uh, you need low latency.
Hmm.
And then I think the other thing that, like you and I have both kind of discovered recently, well, in the last 5 years, I guess, is that a lot of times they're just super convenient uh, not to have a schema when you're just trying to basically collect JSON documents. You're not doing a lot of updates on them. You just need to construct them and put them in a place where you can retrieve them later. Um, so even if you're not taking advantage of the performance aspects of those databases, just being able to use them without building a bunch of tables and defining constraints and so forth, and um, also not having to worry too much about migrations and things like that
Hmm.
is of considerable value for certain types of applications.
I like them in that second category. Write heavy stuff, the right latency, the right response times tend to be really fast with these things, although you do have to worry potentially about eventual consistency and concurrent writes and things like that. I usually try to think in terms of that, like I'm going to dump a bunch of documents in this thing. They don't need to relate to each other. That sounds like a good use for that.
The one that we've been using is Cosmos for that's not too much of a sales pitch, and I think that I think the level of consistency that they provide is pretty good. Um, it's a little bit better than eventual consistency, and I also like the optimistic locking options. I think that's a pretty clever idea.
Hmm. One thing I've changed my mind about in the last few years is Slack. When I first started using, it was HipChat. I first started using HipChat in my first role as a software developer. This is great. Nobody has to talk to me. I don't have to walk over and talk to people. I can dump code and images and screenshot anything in here. Emojis. I've got dancing parrots. And over my career, I've realized I tend to write a lot more than people who are writing back to me. I don't know, maybe because of my background as a writer. When I used to be a freelance journalist, maybe I just had type words per minute quickly. I don't even know. But I think there's two features about Slack that I think it's more of a mixed bag. Um, One is it's hard for me to tell if I'm overwhelming somebody with like a lot of text in a short amount of time. The other thing is if I'm in a bunch of Slack conversations that are already really involved, there's no obvious indicator for somebody who comes to me on Slack that I'm already doing something. I'm already talking to people, and more interruption is not going to help me. It's like I wish they had a little identifier, which is like Eric is already talking to 4 people, and that like talking to is like has been going on for a few minutes. So it's
Yeah,
probably not able to handle your request. So I've kind of changed my mind about Slack. I think it's a mixed bag. There's like a devil in the details type of thing.
I would kind of agree with you on that one. I've gone back and forth on it as well. When I first started using it, I thought this is a great tool, and then I went through a phase where I was like, "Wow, this is super, super distracting. I
Yeah.
need to,
Yeah.
I need to turn off all of the, all of the notifications." Um, One thing I will say about Slack, though, and this is kind of embarrassing, is that I use it very frequently to send myself stuff.
Oh, I use it that way too. Is that embarrassing? I didn't know I should be embarrassed about that. I put
Yeah,
notes in there all the time.
it just feels so. I don't know. It feels so hacky. It's like put, dropping a link into a Slack window just so that you can save it later to send to somebody else, or can
Yeah, you're right, because it's got to go out to their server and like get stored there forever.
right.
It's probably an abuse of technology.
Yeah, but
You got any others? Anything that would be surprising to hear that you change your mind about? In a long career like yours, you probably change your mind about a lot of things.
I was extremely resistant to Docker for a long time,
Okay, this
and
one surprises me. I'm surprised.
yeah, and Docker's so pervasive now that I feel kind of bad about it. But
Maybe that's why it surprises me, just because it's ubiquitous, and I know I don't question it.
yeah, I was introduced to it pretty early, maybe like 2012 or something like that.
Mhm.
And my first reaction was, "Oh, that's a really clever, interesting technology. I don't see immediately why I need that." And for a few years, it was basically that attitude toward it. This I don't. This is not providing me any utility. And even I think projects that we were working on around probably 2016 or so.
Mhm.
We were using stuff like Salt Stack to do deployments, and I thought, hey, this is good stuff. I don't see why I wouldn't want to use this going forward.
Well, we were
And
deploying to
so,
virtual machines at that point is what you're talking about? Not Docker containers.
yeah, we were using Salt Stack, but it was just to push stuff up to AWS,
Mhm.
um,
To VMs.
to VMs. Yeah, and so probably 2017, I think, is the I was working on a project and decided I really needed to use Amazon ECS. Um,
Ooh,
uh,
sorry.
yeah, I thought I would get benefits out of the auto scaling, which I did, but it was in the process of using that that I started to really see the value and the usefulness of Docker. And I don't know why it took me 5 years to realize what everybody else had already picked up on.
Yeah, what were you
But
so resistant to with Docker?
I don't really know. I mean, I think part of it is, you know, Docker's a little bit, it's a little bit of a learning curve there. Making a Docker file is non-trivial, and
Mhm.
you know, getting the layers right is a little bit tricky and hard to understand.
Mhm.
Um,
Layer caching and rebuilding and things like that.
exactly, and I think if you're not using something like ECS or Kubernetes, for me, the benefit of it is far less apparent. But anyway, it was probably around that point in time that I had a sort of total reversal on my attitude about it. And,
Mm.
now in 2023, I can't imagine living without it really.
What was that joke you used to talk about? If it works on my machine. Yeah,
Oh
I know
yeah,
you told me this. You used to make fun of it.
there's this meme. Um, I think it comes from a Johnny Depp movie, and he's sitting on this park bench with a little kid. And I don't even remember what the movie was, but in the meme, the little kid has this sad look on his face, and he says, "But it works on my machine." And Johnny Depp sort of looks at him with this comforting look on his face and says, "Well, then we'll ship your machine." And and people say this is how Docker started.
Hmm.
But and there was a time when I sort of did feel that way about it. Was that it felt like you were building a whole Linux distro and then trying to deploy that. But um, yeah, I just I don't can't totally explain why it took me so long to get up to speed on that, but I would definitely say that's probably one of the more significant changes of viewpoint I've had on a particular technology.
I think my initial reaction to Docker was, "Whoa, this is cool. It's a universal binary, sort of. Like that was the goal always, right? We'll just build a thing we can run it anywhere. Ah, that sounds rad. I can package whatever I want in this thing and run it wherever I want to, sort of." And honestly, my reaction to Docker once I encountered it was, this was probably 2014, 2015, maybe. I was like, "Is there a company that I can just give them a Docker file and my repo, and they can just run the container for me, please? Take my money." Right? Scale it.
Right.
Can you just do that? I don't want Heroku. I don't want virtual machines. I want to pay someone to run my containers. Thank you very much. I guess I was the right audience for Docker. One thing about Docker I find is that when people at work come to me with why won't my container build or what's wrong, there's all this really, I think, arcane, random Linux knowledge that comes up because we're building these containers. These Docker images mostly are inheriting from a Linux-based layer. And it's like, oh, well, you need to set this thing or take this file. Or there's just like 20 years of Linux knowledge that I would never expect these people at work to. I started out playing with Linux 20 years ago as a hobbyist, and there's like just random bits of knowledge that help me debug their random Docker problems. So sometimes I'm a little bit disappointed that so much Linux systems knowledge can be, I don't know about required, but like there's some arcane stuff in there.
Yeah, I guess that wasn't a point of concern for me since I kind of grown up on Linux, but or grown up on Unix. But um, yeah, yeah, just a big flip there for me.
I have one for you, and I think you might be surprised by it. But Haskell, I think you probably identified me as someone who was a huge Haskell fan for a long time. Always talking about Haskell, involved in the community, doing open source, contributing to open source projects in Haskell. And I wouldn't say so much that I haven't changed my mind about The language, I think it's still a great language. I have seen code I loved in Haskell. I think what I changed my mind about was when I first started doing Haskell, I thought this is going to revolutionize what I'm doing at work. I'm going to introduce it at work. People are going to they're going to want to use it. And I thought they're going to want to use it. I came to that conclusion because I thought, why wouldn't you want to write programs first and foremost for correctness? And Haskell makes you jump through a lot of hoops before you can compile a program successfully. And you can, encode these invariants in the type system. So you can make correct by design applications. And yeah, it's kind of inconvenient. There's a big learning curve. I just thought I'm going to introduce this to people who care a lot about their software that I work with, and they're going to immediately be like, "Yes, give me more. How do I get in that door?" And it never happened.
Yeah.
and then and then Rust came along and it was like, wow, this cargo is so convenient and I get a lot of these type system effect. I can build stuff in the type system. It doesn't have higher order, higher kinded types like Haskell does. Um, we're not encoding side effects in the type system in Rust like we are in Haskell. And I slowly realized, wow, this is so much nicer to use. It has a lot of things I liked in Haskell. um, and I guess I don't care as much about encoding side effects and types. Like having side effects and type system, the famous Haskell thing is you will know if your code can launch missiles or not. Like it turned out I didn't care. I thought I cared. Turned out I didn't care. I still love Haskell, but I just don't think I'm going to be using it at work, and I don't see a reason to.
Yeah, this is a hard one for me because, this is kind of something that we bonded over in the early days of our friendship. Um, and, I have a son who's a type theorist and kind of an OCaml and Haskell expert. So I want these things to succeed and thrive. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good way to say it. I want them to succeed and thrive too. I want formal methods to succeed and thrive.
right. But I'm kind of in the same camp, I guess, where I just I have a hard time imagining now both using it at work and also persuading other people to use it at work.
Yeah. I
Uh,
thought I could. I'm
which,
a pretty persuasive person.
yeah, I would agree. If you can't persuade them, I certainly can't. Um, maybe it's just a matter of we're not doing things that require that level of rigor, and so it's the effort's not worth it. Might be part of the problem, but um, I don't know. I think these things will find a place, or
Mm.
some successor of them will find a place. But
Mhm.
yeah, I sort of agree with your take on it right now.
I just never I thought if I can tell someone, "Look, you can write this program so that someone else who contributes to it, they will not violate these invariants just by." You don't have to go nuts. You don't have to be a type astronaut. That was a problem. People would sometimes like self-flagellate into being like type. They had this incredible like they'd use gadgets and stuff, and in a lot of cases those are fine. I'm not saying those are not fine, but for the work we were doing, you generally don't need that. You can make something that's well typed and pretty explicit, and you don't have to go deep into type. You don't need dependent types, and just I didn't sell anybody. I'm surprised by your Docker one. Do you have any others that are surprising? That would surprise me that you changed your mind about?
I don't know if this one would surprise you, but it's kind of the reverse situation of my previous examples in that this is something that I was totally sold on for a long time and then gradually sort of changed my mind about it. And that is the concept of design patterns.
Ooh,
Um,
like OOP Gang of Four. Is that what you're talking about specifically?
yeah, specifically those. And then um, I don't know if people remember this now. I don't know if this is still happening or not, but after the Gang of Four stuff got popular, there was a huge explosion in interest in patterns, and there was actually a couple of conferences around the idea of design patterns.
Mm.
Um, there was a there was a conference called PLOP for PLOP for a few years where people would get together and talk about design patterns.
Mm.
Um, anyway, when I first encountered these, it was kind of at the point in my career when I was starting to build bigger things and or had the responsibility for designing things and building bigger systems. And I think their appeal to me at the time was this sort of guidance about, if you're trying to solve this problem, here's kind of a canonical way to do that.
Here's an
Um,
existing pattern. You follow those steps and you will get a recipe that
right.
produces something useful.
This this is a thing that people have done and that has succeeded, apparently.
Mm.
And so I think that was exciting and kind of comforting to reassuring to know that there was, somebody out there thinking about these things and that they'd come to some conclusion on the best way to do them.
Mm. Yeah, that is
Um,
comforting in other areas too. When I do system design, it's comforting to find people who are describing similar problems.
right. And I don't think that's necessarily untrue now. I mean, I think there's still a lot of you can still get a lot of value out of the information in the especially in the original design patterns book.
Mm.
But in the years following the Gang of Four book, I have sitting on a shelf at home. I have like 3 or 4 books which are proceedings of design pattern conferences,
Mm.
and I started to get this sense that people were inventing patterns so that they had things to publish about.
Oh wow.
And it it sort of got to this point where, wait a second, if there's all these design patterns, if there's hundreds of them, I forget how many there were in the original book, maybe 20 something, but if there's hundreds of them or thousands of them, it sort of defeats the purpose because, now I'm kind of back to square one of trying to search for a good way to do a particular thing and
Mm.
not being able to
Mm.
find a particular solution.
Well, that's
Um,
interesting. So it's almost like there's so many that you start wondering, are these things canonical?
yeah, exactly. You wonder if they're canonical, and you wonder if, is there some way to relate what you're doing with that pattern to the objective that you're trying to achieve?
Mm.
Can you say this way of doing this thing is solving this problem better than alternative ways?
Mm.
And I I never did really see that connection. I don't know if people have done research on that or not. I think it's kind of a general problem with architecture is, you sometimes people do architecture because they have attributes that they're trying to achieve. They're trying to make a system that will scale or they're trying to make a system that's robust. But other times people sit down and they do architecture because, that's the way they did architecture on their last project or whatever. Um,
I guess I'm wondering
so,
if they're when I encountered the design patterns, I had already been trying to learn Haskell. This is earlier in my career. And my I'm trying to figure out how to say this without sounding like a complete rube. they, there was a feeling of arbitrariness I had when I first encountered them. I thought, well, are these arbitrary? Because I'm in Haskell, and Haskell has these things that come from mathematics. Like it has a monoid, and I can hold the concept of a monoid in my head, and I can encounter a problem and go, oh, that's a monoid, which has there are laws associated with it,
right,
and but maybe I was overly enamored with that. Oh, there's mathematical rigor to this idea. This is a contravariant functor, and that is a thing that exists in logic and mathematics and in type systems. And so it exists as an objective truth in the world. But your gang of poor design patterns is just arbitrary junk somebody dreamed up, right?
I wouldn't go that far necessarily, but and I think a lot of those original design patterns have a lot of merit, and they are they may not be mathematical, but they're, achieving things that people were trying to achieve in a, in a good engineering way.
Hmm.
Things are, uh, you know, you're achieving cohesion and decoupling and things like that. And so I think there's a lot of merit in what they were describing initially. But again, I think it just comes back to this idea that they became too numerous and there was no real way to connect what people were proposing to, some way of determining that that was at least a local optimum in terms of solving that particular problem.
Hmm. I guess I
Um,
have two. Oh, sorry, I had two questions for you.
Go ahead.
So, one of the critiques I used to see of design patterns, and this is actually one that would come up a lot in the Haskell community, was some of these are useful, sure, but the rest of these problems only exist because you're using C++ or Java. If you're not using those languages, you don't have that particular problem. And I wish I had a better example, but there's a famous blog post I should find about this. It might have been someone in working in Lisp who was saying, "Look, it's a famous blog post. I don't have this problem in Lisp, or it's trivially solved in Lisp. This is a map." you know.
Yeah, that's true as well. And that, design patterns have always been very deeply connected to object oriented programming.
Hmm.
And I guess, there's been a little bit of like there's the Fowler books on enterprise patterns, which I guess don't necessarily dictate, like a pub sub system is not necessarily an object oriented system,
Yeah,
let's
or
say.
Enterprise Messaging Patterns was a book I really liked. Yeah.
Right. But I think there's some of that. And then I think, I remember an article uh, sort of cribbing from Dijkstra. There was a visitor pattern considered harmful article that came out in the 90s. And so a lot of the original patterns that were in the Gang of Four book came under a lot of scrutiny, and some of them were sort of dismissed as being either redundant or not as useful as they purported to be. So,
They canceled them. Some of them were canceled
yeah, they were canceled by the
by people like Dijkstra, functional programming advocate.
um, yeah, I was going to make a political joke, but that's probably a bad idea. Um,
Well, so here's my other question. If you interviewed somebody, they did not know any design patterns, would you hire them?
in this day and age, I probably would. There was a time when that was kind of a standard interview question,
Table
like,
stakes.
yes, tell us one of these, like, tell me your favorite design pattern uh, questions, which was, you know, sort of designed to get people to reveal both that they knew about them and that they had considered them enough to actually use them in anger.
Hmm. Was there
Um,
like a threshold, like they have to know at least these four or four total or something like that? Or-
no, I know. I never had a checklist or anything, but yeah, I think in 2023 it's less of an issue. I still see it, however, in job ads all the time. You know,
I really only see it when people do Java. It seems like still like a big thing in the Java community, which is not I don't mean that in a negative. I'm not trying to throw shade on them.
yeah, I see it. I see it for a lot of object-oriented related jobs, Java, C++, Microsoft.NET type stuff, and
Mhm.
I don't know. Maybe it says something about the generation of the hiring manager or something like that. So yeah, I probably wouldn't. I probably wouldn't use that as a disqualifying thing if people were unaware of them now.
Are there any patterns in your pattern? Sorry, I don't mean to riff on your talking about object oriented patterns, but I'm talking about like things that are common amongst the mind changes that you've had. Anything that you see as a like a pattern and how you've changed your mind over your career? Or is it just you gain more information and then were able to change your mind because of that?
I think it goes back to what I said originally, which is that in almost all these cases where I've changed my mind about something, it's because that thing was in contrast to something that I already knew well. And I think maybe that's the lesson to learn is that you you have to be open-minded about things, even if you have formerly dismissed them.
Mm,
You know, that you as you go through your career, like NoSQL databases did not disappear. So
mm,
clearly people were finding value from them. So I think at some point it was my responsibility to figure out where the value was because, you know, clearly my opinion was far from the consensus
Yeah, I
as
had that
similar.
happen to me with Shakespeare's history plays after college. Like, wow, people really like these things. Maybe they are worth reading. Turned out they were pretty good.
Yeah. So I guess Docker is the Henry V of technology or something. But um, um, I think maybe on the flip side, another lesson is just because something is universally accepted and hyped, you don't necessarily need to uh, adopt it for yourself. And,
Hmm,
of course, the problem here is like with everything, you're basically looking at two extremes: cases where you've rejected things because they were unfamiliar, and cases where you've changed your mind about things because they were too hyped. And so, at some point,
mhm.
you have to figure out how you're going to make your own engineering decisions.
That's pretty good. The rejecting the unfamiliar and clinging to the familiar reminds me of of a phenomenon I read about many years ago. And when I read about it, I thought, "Wow, this sounds similar to what's governing the responses at work when I say, "Hey, let's look at this thing," or somebody says to me, "Let's look at this thing," and my immediate reaction is, "Ugh, no! Why would we do that?" The name of the phenomenon is mere exposure effect. Mere is spelled MERE. Um, and actually,
Not li-
it's
n- not like Meerkat.
not like meerkat, not like a mirror. It's mere exposure effect.
Uh,
And they first studied this in animals. And what they found was that when you introduce a novel stimulus to an animal, it will often respond with either disgust or fear. And then just by increasing familiarity over time, it will go from disgust, fear to like passive acceptance to actually liking the thing or appreciating it. And only thing that happens in this timeline is you encounter that thing more. So I actually looked up though, because of your description here, I was thinking about it. I looked up Wikipedia. Wikipedia says mirror exposure effect is a psychological phenomenon by which people tend to develop liking or disliking for things merely because they are familiar with them. In social psychology. This effect is sometimes called the familiarity principle. Um, in studies of interpersonal attraction, the more often people see a person, the more pleasing and likable they find that person. And one other little note here: the scholar best known for developing mirror exposure effect is Robert Junk. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. Before conducting his research, he observed that exposure to a novel stimulus initially elicits a fear avoidance response in all organisms. Each subsequent exposure to the novel stimulus causes less fear and more interest in the observing organism. After repeated exposure, the observant organism will begin to react fondly to the once novel stimulus. To me, this speaks to the way in which somebody will like come to love Elasticsearch over time. Just one example. It sounds similar to your familiarity. Being unfamiliar makes me afraid of it. Being familiar over time makes me accept it. And then eventually, maybe I find it compelling.
that makes sense to me. I mean, as I was saying before, if something is hyped and then it flames out, you're probably were correct to dismiss it. But if something becomes popular and stays popular, and you're still resisting it, you probably start need to start thinking about your assumptions there.
Hmm. I still don't like React. Can I admit that? People are going to hate me if I admit that.
You can admit it, but it probably reduces your chances of getting a front end programming job.
Hopefully, nobody in our audience gets really angry with me for not liking React after all this time. I'm wrong. So, everybody else, the world has decided. I think I'm okay with being wrong. All right. Thanks so much, Mike. Very good examples in there. And I think there's a lot to learn from in that. Um, I will try to be the kind of person who can change my mind.
Go for it.
All right. This has been Picture Me Coding. My name is Eric Aker. We'll see you next week.
See you next time.
Bye bye.